Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another JVS movie review. Today we are bringing you the review of HBO Max's remake of the very classic film Witches. I know there's a lot of people out there, especially if you're younger, you may not know that Witches is a remake. If you don't, shame on you. It is on Netflix. You need to check it out. And it stars Angelica Houston in an amazing performance throughout. But this remake, starring Octavia Spencer, Anne Hathaway, and the young man is Jazir. I hope I'm saying his name right here. Jazir Kadim Bruno is the young guy here who plays the lead character in this film. And let's give you a quick synopsis of Witches. A young boy and his grandmother have a run-in with a coven of witches and their leader. Now, Witches is based off a very successful children's book. And again, it was made into a very good cult classic film in the 90s. And I guess HBO Max, with Robert Zemeckis, who directed this one, decided that this is a film that definitely could use a remake. Now, this remake was supposed to drop in theaters, but because of the pandemic and everything that's happening in the world, HBO Max decided to drop it on their streaming platform instead. And a quick reaction to the film, I'm going to say that was probably for the best. I don't think this is a film that a lot of people would have went to theaters to see. Granted, it's a lot of people who remember the original, but I don't think they would have went to theaters or cared to get a remake of the original film. The original film, while it's a cult classic, it's not something that like lives in people's minds as something that you like have to see. It's not like if someone was to come out and remake A Christmas Story or anything of that nature, something that is also a cult classic, or like Rocky Horror Picture Show, something that's a cult classic but stays in people's memory as something that I need to see again, Witches isn't that. Witches is just something that was really, really good for its time period and has developed an audience over the years, but not a cult following. But it is a cult classic, if that makes any sense to you. Now, the film from the beginning just completely flips everything that we saw from the original film. And I'm not just talking about flipping the race of characters, which here doesn't matter one bit so, because Octavia Spencer is majestic in everything she does. And it was times in this movie when she was catering to her grandson for what happens to his parents in this film that I was just like, man, I wish my grandmother was Octavia Spencer and she would cook me fried chicken and cornbread that looked as good as the fried chicken and cornbread looked in this movie. So again, the switching of the race didn't matter, but it switched the tone of the film and the way it opens up as we see the boy live through a tragic accident where he loses both of his parents, and then he gets his grandmother, and then everything with the witches pops up. And I think the beginning of the film, they did just enough to tell you that this is going to be different than the original Witches, which is a good thing, which is a really good thing. When you're doing a remake, you really need to try to separate yourself from the original, and they do a good job at the beginning of separating it from the original. Now, my biggest and only issue is the voiceover with Chris Rock. At the whole time before this film, when it happened, I felt that was highly unnecessary, and it feels unnecessary even now. And it's been weeks since I saw this film. It still feels unnecessary that they had the voiceover at all with Chris Rock. But again, as the plot opens itself up and we get to the familiar themes of everything, and we finally get introduced to the full coven of witches, and we see Anne Hathaway embrace the role famously done by Angelica Houston, that's when the film at times to me falls flat. Anne Hathaway is great in this movie, just as over the top and everything as you would love her to be, but something is lost in her performance that was there with Angelica Houston, and it's at time distracting that is so lost. Even though this film looks a heck of a lot better than the original did, Robert Zemeckis does a great job at filming this movie. It looks beautiful. It looks expensive, but it never translates to give me the heart that the original gave me. And part of it is that, again, Anne Hathaway, while good in this movie, it was something about Angelica Houston's character in the original and her performance that made you care a little bit more. The biggest difference is that Octavia Spencer is so strong as a grandmother here. And the first film had a weaker actress who I cannot remember off the top of my head, actress who played the grandmother. So it evens itself out here. Now, changes from the original and changes to this remake. Adding another kid, unnecessary. Um, the ending, which we will not get into, highly upset me because it unnecessarily changed a lot of things that worked in the original, and it leaves you here with a conclusion that is clearly trying to set up sequels here. Like the end of this movie is clearly attempting to set this up as a series when the original felt just like a standalone when it was completed, and this one doesn't. And I think that's a fatal flaw of it. And as I said before, the score is really good in this film also. The tone that's set in this film, really, really good. Really, really fun fantasy type tone that's set in this film for kids, parents to really enjoy. At times, it may be a little too scary for the really, really, really little ones, but other than that, it works in its tone completely. Its pacing is really off at times. It feels like at times it's trying to be one thing, and then it flips to something completely different, and then it feels like it's interjecting characters that I'm going to say aren't necessary to give as much of a highlight to that they did in this movie. But again, it works as a streaming movie. If I'd known that this was just an HBO Max original film and it was dropping on HBO Max, I would say, okay, cool. It's just a nice, fun little family film. Not the best, definitely not the worst, but a fun little family film. The point that this was supposed to go into theaters and people thought people would see this in theaters is puzzling to me. This is not the movie for theaters. This is clearly the movie to stay at home and watch. Other than that, without going into too much of a plot detail, because that's where my biggest issues were in the midway through the second to the third act is where I had a lot of issues with this film. But we can't go into it because if I did, I would have to spoil the movie for you. I still want you to check it out. So, Witches on HBO Max. Out of a possible 10, I'm going to give Witches 5.5 out of 10. Octavia Spencer is great in this movie. Anne Hathaway is really good. But when I compare Anne Hathaway with Angelica Houston, it's a huge drop-off. Granted, at times the pacing is pretty decent in this movie. It looks great. But so many other things just falls apart. And the biggest thing is that it's a huge letdown from the villain in this film. Anne Hathaway, while great, I never fully feared her as the villain in this movie. Unlike Angelica Houston, and when I saw Witches as a kid, and when I recently rewatched it again on Netflix, I felt like she was a villain. And that's what Anne Hathaway doesn't give you in this film. But check it out. Let us know what you think. Witches on HBO Max, available now for all to see. This has been another JVS movie review. Peace, people.